So good evening. Well, good evening where I am. Good morning to some of you. Today is the third of this series of satsangs, and we're holding it in Zoom. And we're not sure whether the internet will hold up, but we're trialing it so that in future, some of the satsangs that we're holding may be able to be more interactive. And some people have said that being within a Zoom meeting can make it feel different. So let's give it a go. In today's satsang, I probably won't be interacting because I'd like to try and carry on the theme that I was on yesterday and expand on it a little bit further. But I think in subsequent satsangs, we can introduce questions from you guys, and that tends to make the talk a little more relevant sometimes. So, a recap of yesterday's talk. It was essentially introducing the fact that there are several explanations that could explain what all of this is. What is the experience of life that we have? And each model was different in nature. One of the models was all of this is happening in God. Everything is an arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, witnessed by consciousness, and that all there is consciousness. There is no objective real world. There is just the experience of a world arising as a dream or an imagination within the mind of God, essentially. And all of this is made of mind, witnessed by mind, and that mind, the mind of God, is having this experience. The experience that each of us is having is the experience God is having from the perspective of each of us. Another model is the model that most closely represents what we experience, which is there is an objectively real world, and there are biological, conscious, sentient beings, humans and animals in that world, and they are able to pick up what is outside them because of the fact that there is consciousness and the specific design of the biological instrument with the senses, and we can essentially pick up what is outside. And that is essentially, therefore, the experience that we have, which is the experience of living in an objective world with objects outside of ourselves. However, in that model, what we have to realize is that the experience of the external world, if there is actually an external world like the experience suggests, the experience of the external world is not seeing the actual external world, but rather it's an image of the external world arising within the consciousness of the human being. And therefore, that too is that we could talk about the experience of life just as we would in the first model that says it's all an arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, witnessed by consciousness. We can say exactly the same thing about this experience if it was explained by model 2, which is the model that says there's an objective real world outside of us. It too, the experience that each of us has, is an arising in consciousness. Everything is made of consciousness and witnessed by consciousness. It doesn't mean that there isn't an external world that is objectively real. However, the experience is not the external world. It is a reflection or an interpretation of the external world, and therefore we can say the same. It is all an arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, witnessed by consciousness. And the third model was saying maybe there's a very advanced civilization, much more advanced than we are, let's say the year 2400, and in that civilization there are entertainment establishments where you can go in and subject yourself to a virtual world, and the experience that you are having is the experience created by a civilization, a technology that is able to project an experience into the consciousness of a human being or some other living entity that decides they want to have a specific experience. It may not be an entertainment facility, it may be a training facility, it may be a rehabilitation facility where someone in that world is induced into a virtual world, and maybe that virtual world is specifically designed to bring about changes in their psychology, their biology, to make them more, to change, to bring about change. So, at the moment we have a certain understanding about how to change the human brain if we look at the year 2020. And maybe in 400 years' time, there might be different technologies, and what we're experiencing might be what someone else is experiencing. And if that's the case, it still is an arising within consciousness, made of consciousness, witnessed by consciousness. Now, what is the point? The point is exactly that whatever model it is that is resulting in this experience of life that we are all having, they all leave us with this experience as being an experience arising in consciousness, made of consciousness, witnessed by consciousness, that everything that exists is a singular experience, an arising within consciousness, meaning not separate from consciousness, that the experience and the consciousness are interdependent. Now, that's the point of introducing the three models. The three models are not there so that we can debate which model it is that creates this. It must be model 1 because that's what non-dual teachings say. It must be model 3 because clearly technology is going to head in that direction. And so it's very likely that these virtual experiences will be available. And then there's those that will say, why does it have to be anything different than what it seems like, which is the experience of a human being in an objective world. The human being is objectively real. It's not about discussing for the sake of picking. It's about discussing in order to realize, to become really present with the current life experience, the experience that everyone has right now, and examine it and see it as an experience, an ever-changing, what we could call multi-sensory experience with thoughts and feelings and emotions, all part of the experience, and see it as a singular arising within consciousness. The within consciousness is so important. Without consciousness, experience wouldn't exist. And I'm not using the word experience to denote subject-object relationship. I'm using experience as in a broader sense. The word experience, as far as I'm concerned, can denote what some of us might have had as oneness, knowing oneness, experientially knowing oneness. That would be a oneness experience, an experience that is designed or put together in such a way that what there is oneness, no separation between subject and object. Subject-object relationship falls away. Now, in some teachings, the word experience is kept specifically for the state where there is the sense of separation, where there is a separate subject aware of objects, and there is a sense of two, the subject and a separate object. And so in non-duality, that experience of life is often referred to as illusion. And liberation, if certain words are used in a certain context, could be called the end of experience. Experience is illusion. Experience is the sense of subject-object relationship. Experience is the sense of separation. And liberation is the recognizing, the realization of oneness, the realization of non-duality, where subject-object relationship falls away. Now, that's just one description in one set of teachings. Is it the truth? Is that what liberation is? Is liberation the realization of oneness such that subject-object relationship falls away? And I would say, no, that is the description within a particular teaching for a very good reason. So that's what this satsang is going to be about. It's about looking at teachings and understanding what change they're trying to bring about and what methodologies they go about using in order to bring about that change, and importantly, how it all links back to peace of mind in daily living. So we were talking about liberation, according to some teachings, is the end of subject-object relationship where oneness is realized experientially. In another teaching, liberation may be described as the end of suffering, without putting on it the necessity for subject-object relationship to have fallen away. We can get carried away sometimes with a concept, which is what teachings are, a set of concepts, and mistake the concept for truth. I'll introduce here a little story that many of you have heard, which was very pertinent in my seeking process. And it was one of the first interactions I had with Ramesh. I think it was my second visit to Mumbai. And what had happened just before the second visit was a very extreme oneness experience where subject-object fell away, and the sense that I was not the body, that I was awareness, aware of everything arising as a spontaneous arising, all contained within consciousness, there being no separation between consciousness and the experience. And the experience was an exact, in a sense, replication of what the non-dual teachings of, for example, Nisargadatta, and in some senses Ramana's teachings, describe. And when that happened, there was no sense that what was aware of the experience was the body. In fact, the thought arose, if someone were to come and hack the arms off this body that was part of the experience, they wouldn't be touching in the slightest what I am. And the experience contained all of the knowing of so many things in it experientially. And so there was little doubt in my mind that that was essentially the lightning strike moment that seekers are waiting for. The end of separation, the end of experiencing oneself as the body or the person, and an experiential knowing oneself as awareness or consciousness, and oneness, accompanied by the ending of fear, you could say. No sense that what I am can be threatened. So I think if that description is heard by someone who has really immersed themselves in the teachings of Nisargadatta, for example, they would say, well, that does sound pretty much like the description of liberation or enlightenment through the teaching of Nisargadatta. That's what I thought, because I had been immersed in the teachings. So when I went to Ramesh, I was sitting down, and prior to this oneness experience, I had for several years had a fairly consistent seeing of life as an arising within consciousness, but it was nowhere near as crisp and extreme as happened for this period in this one day. And so afterwards, there was still very much this sense that everything is arising in consciousness, but the intensity of it had fallen away. And I, at that point, thought that there was obviously still a little bit of stuff that needed to be released. And once that had happened, then that experience of oneness would set in, and I would live the rest of my life as consciousness, aware from a sort of witnessing perspective, aware of life unfolding, the experience of life unfolding. So Ramesh saw me and remembered me from my previous visit a couple of months before, and he said, "Oh, Roger, nice to see you. What brings you here?" And so I explained what had happened, and I explained it at that time. My thinking was very much along the lines of non-separation. There is no subject-object. There is just consciousness. Everything arising in consciousness. What you are is consciousness, and cause and effect is an illusion. Separation is an illusion. And so my language was had been very trained by myself to not make mistakes with how I describe things. So I was able to describe everything fairly accurately, I would say. And so after I described the sense of what had happened, Ramesh said, "Don't worry, Roger, that was just an experience." And nothing in that statement resonated. I thought I must have explained it incorrectly. So I tried to fill in some gaps maybe that I had left, although I didn't think I had left many gaps. And once again, he said, "Roger, don't worry about it. That was just an experience." And so a third time, just in case he hadn't got it, because I didn't think he had understood what I was saying, and he once again said, "Roger, don't worry about it. That was just an experience." So I found this a bit odd, because actually it was the experiential arising of oneness as described in the teachings. And at that point, I had decided, well, maybe he doesn't actually know what those other teachings, in fact, the teaching of his teacher, Nisargadatta, he doesn't know that experientially. And so I left a little unsatisfied and unconvinced that, "Roger, don't worry about it. That was just an experience." Because to me, at that time, liberation was simply about the end of separation. That's what I thought the objective was about. That's what the teachings that I had been immersed in seemed to be hammering home and trying to deliver some change along those lines. And that seemed to have been delivered. And so if it was delivered, then you don't question the teaching, because what the teachings talk about, when it suddenly manifests as one's own experience, where the person, the individual, is really not there anymore, it seems like there's no room for doubt, because the experience is confirming, you could say, what the teachings say is available as the end of illusion. It turns out in the teaching of non-doership as put forward by Ramesh, and now what I share mostly, the definition of liberation is not about a state. It's about the ending of suffering. So liberation, enlightenment, according to the concept within this teaching, is that liberation is the end of suffering, continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in. And in practical terms, suffering is the feeling of uncomfortableness with oneself, which arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. Now, the teaching does rely on the recognition that everything is one, that there is no separation. However, the recognition that sets in place when the end of suffering as a result of this teaching settles in is not an experiential recognition of oneness, at least not in as extreme a form as arose in that peak experience. The recognition is a recognition that what I am as a human being is not separate from life. I was spawned from life. I have never had an independent existence from life. I've never been insulated from life. So the effect of rain in the environment is always part of who I am. If rain falls on me, I'm not insulated from it. If someone says something to me, whatever is said is received by my system. My system has received information from my teachers, from my parents, from my friends, from society. And so all of that has influenced me, and I am essentially one with the whole universe in an indirect way. And in a very direct way, I am one with life as it has directly impacted me. And when there is a recognition that what I am as a human being is essentially a biological and psychological instrument through which consciousness is functioning, and as a combination of a biological and psychological instrument plus consciousness, that combination is what we could call the person. And the person, on a biological and psychological level, is a result of its genes and up-to-date conditioning. Up-to-date conditioning is the cumulative effect of all of the new conditioning delivered from life moment after moment, from the time of conception up to the present moment. And the genes have grown in such a way that determines my eye color and my brain structure, my heart. But the genes don't exist in isolation, they exist simultaneously with the new conditioning that life is delivering moment after moment after moment. So even though we say genes and up-to-date conditioning, they're actually one. They become one because they coexist. And so when we recognize that there is no separation between myself and life, and that I am essentially being lived by life, these words are coming out, not because Roger chooses them, but because life is forcing them out of me in a sense, because life has created me to be exactly the way I am. And therefore, in a particular circumstance, I'm bound to function exactly according to my makeup. So we find ourselves as a unique individual. In a particular moment, we are exactly one way, a machine, a very complex biological machine, exactly one way. And we find ourselves in a very unique circumstance. And the response or the reaction to the circumstance is exactly what it is, and it couldn't be different. If it were different, we'd have to deduct that either my genes and up-to-date conditioning was different or the circumstance was different, because the way that I respond in this particular circumstance with my particular makeup is a result of those factors. And therefore, if the response or reaction was different, the factors would have to be different. Now, that's not generally how we see ourselves. We generally see ourselves as independent, insulated, autonomous human being that essentially means I am separate from life. And so we relate to ourselves as being the ones that are in control of what we say and how we act and how we feel. And that is the belief in personal doership. And as you might see, that belief in personal doership essentially creates a separation where there really is none. That belief in personal doership is not seeing that what we are is an instrument designed by life because we've never been separate from life. It says I am actually separate, insulated, and autonomous. And when I make a decision, when I think, when I speak, it is my decision because we have to ask ourselves, what is this I? Who's this I in the notion that I chose? Because when we really look at it, we find what Roger is a very uniquely designed machine, but designed by life. So there is no chooser of the thoughts. There is no chooser of the words. There are words happening. There are thoughts happening. There are emotions happening, but not created by a separate me, but rather a result of the biological instrument through which consciousness is functioning. So that deep recognition, so if the explanation I'm putting forward is something that resonates and you say, I want to investigate this further, I want to see if it's true. Is it true that my thoughts, when they arise based on something that I have seen, smelt, tasted, touched, or heard in the environment, because of the environment being exactly the way it is, because the environment, the circumstance is not something I was in control of? Is it true that my thoughts and my actions are a spontaneous result of the specific circumstance and how that circumstance interacts with my very specific makeup in this moment? And as we investigate this and find time and time again that whatever happens through me is a reaction, a response, and not something that a me has created. And so as we look at this, we see this fiction of this me, which is really, when we look at it, it's a psychological addition to the person, which in itself is also part of its programming, part of its genes and up-to-date conditioning. So life has programmed the human being to think that they are separate from life, that they are autonomous, and that there is a me chooser. So life has forced the human being to not see their automaticness, to not see their spontaneousness according to their design. And at some point, life, through the deliverance of new conditioning that might create contemplation, which in itself is just a reaction of the body-mind organism, that contemplation may create a feedback loop that actually gets the biological instrument, which includes the intellect, to realize I'm just a machine, a biological machine. Now, don't get me wrong, just because I'm using the word machine or robot doesn't mean I'm reducing the human experience down to anything less than it actually is. This is a machine that is beyond our appreciation as we generally might understand the word machine. We might think of an old steam train that's very mechanical and made of iron, and that's what we think of as a machine, or a computer. The truth is, we are a biological instrument that is extremely complex, with a brain that has billions and trillions of neural networks and is firing at a pace immensely faster than the most complex supercomputer that man has created. So we're a machine in principle, but that machine is so complex that it creates the human experience. So by me saying that we are a machine, and by the machine realizing it's a machine, isn't reducing life down to something less than we've always experienced. There will still be the capacity to feel love, to have emotions, to feel compassion, to get angry, to be sad. All of those are human expressions, human reactions, responses based on the circumstance we find ourselves in and our particular makeup. The realization I am essentially an instrument designed by life to function exactly the way I function is an attitudinal change. It's a shift from the attitude of personal doership that includes with it the attitude of attachment to outcomes. And it's a shift to the recognition that everything happens according to God's will. Now, I'm using the word God as a placeholder. We could say everything that happens according to life or life's will. I see that I am not separate from life, that the other is not separate from life, that what happened at the beginning of time, the beginning of life or the beginning of the universe is not separate from what is happening right now. So in this teaching, the understanding is about the end of separation, but it's about the end of separation becoming so deeply known and seen, but it's not about the end of separation on the experiential level. Do we need the end of separation on an experiential level such that subject-object relationship falls away? I thought we did. Going back 15 or 20 years when I had this experience and went to Ramesh, my intellect, the working mind, hadn't quite got round to fully appreciating that this search is about peace of mind. It's about something very practical. When we talk about something very practical, we might think that oneness is extremely practical because we mistake the word practical with experiential. And often we think about theory versus experience. We can theorize something, and that means that we understand in our head. And the teachings are telling us it's not about concepts. It's not about an intellectual understanding. So it's about an experiential knowing, right? So I'm now going back to the oneness teachings, which let me make it clear. I have a great respect for the oneness teachings. My process included, as I'm pointing out, the first few years was about the oneness teachings. Do they serve a purpose? Absolutely. There's a big shift that happens. So this is why this series of talks is happening, because I'd like to point out how we end up at a point where there is unbroken peace of mind, meaning we find ourselves in life, we get or we come across disappointing circumstances that are painful. Take the current world situation. There are people that are living in uncertain times. We're unsure about where this pandemic will lead. There are economic uncertainties as well as health uncertainties. There are the emotional uncertainties about how our loved ones are going to be affected. And as the human is ordinarily designed and structured, the human being experiences life as suffering. So uncertain times are bound to trigger a certain form of uncomfortableness with oneself, which will manifest in the way often as an uncomfortableness with the other or an uncomfortableness with life. But ultimately, that uncomfortableness with the other and life comes back to being an uncomfortableness with ourselves. Now, I'd like to talk about what changes take place in order for us to move from being a human being structured in such a way that we feel this uncomfortableness with oneself and the other and life, to the point where the uncomfortableness is no longer there. We find ourselves in life, we find ourselves in the same sort of situations, sometimes pleasurable and sometimes painful. And yet the uncomfortableness is not there. So what happens? in simple terms, general terms, I would say the body-mind organism changes. And it changes because life delivers a specific set of new conditioning to the body-mind organism that changes it. Now, in the non-dual teachings, enlightenment is in the top-down non-dual teaching. So what do I mean by top-down? Top-down teachings tend to be the teachings that start off by pointing at your nature as consciousness or awareness. What they tend to do is they tend to look at life from outside of daily life, sort of transcendent view where you are not anything to do with the body or thinking or characteristics. And they will describe you as the formless awareness in which all of life arises. And so that's known as a top-down teaching, where the pointer is to what you are in essence, or what life is, and what is where in a more broad sense. And a bottom-up teaching approaches the topic of liberation from practical daily living perspective, from the person or the human being perspective. So that's what I mean by top-down versus bottom-up teachings, and they're both equally valid. Now, I see teachings as all dovetailing in with each other, and sort of a seeker will transition from one teaching to the next, depending on what is appropriate. So what happens along the seeking process that allows us or delivers peace of mind? Essentially, it means the system has changed. Now, the top-down teachings tend not to talk about liberation having anything to do with the person. In fact, they'll say that liberation is a spontaneous happening that has nothing to do with the body-mind. Now, we're starting to get to what I'm hoping this talk is doing. It's trying to show why the two teachings say very different things, and yet they are both equally as valid. They are both teachings. Neither of them are the truth. No teaching is the truth. If we look really carefully at our own process, what has been happening to us. So some teachings, the top-down teachings, may well say there is no such thing as process. Process is an idea of the intellect that is part of the illusion. A bottom-up teaching that starts with the daily living perspective talks in terms of the human being and causality in time and space. They can seem like they're contradictory, and we might think, well, which one's right? And we'll tend to go for the one that seems more mystical, unless we go for that and then we find it just doesn't land in us. And we may then find that we resonate with a different approach. So I say they're both teachings. They're not contradictory. They're complementary. We have to come to see how they're complementary. And in order to see how they're complementary, we need to understand why each of them is saying what they're saying. And in order to understand that, I assert that this process is a process of change on the level of the body-mind organism. So a teaching that tells you enlightenment and liberation and the process of enlightenment has nothing to do with process, has nothing to do with the body-mind organism. It has everything to do with awareness recognizing itself. And the human being, the body-mind organism, the human being, isn't the one that makes that happen. they would say there is no such thing as process. You are already enlightened. I assert that what is actually happening in the process of liberation is change, all on the level of the body, mind, organism. So a teaching that says liberation has nothing to do with the body, mind, organism is talking to the body, mind, organism. A teacher can only talk to the body, mind, organism. So if it has nothing to do with the body, mind, organism, why is the teacher talking to the body, mind, organism? They're talking to the body, mind, organism because the process of liberation is a process, and it has everything to do with change on the level of the body, mind, organism. However, saying it doesn't is part of what is necessary in order to bring about the change on the level of the body, mind, organism. Sounds crazy, right? That's what's happening. And we have to, at some point, realize what's happening. Otherwise, we will go around after change has happened on the level of the body, mind, organism, change that may have brought about a shift where life is witnessed or perceived from what seems like a point outside of the body, or at least from a standpoint that is radically different from where life was perceived previously, which means experientially there has been a change. And because that change has happened, and because the change feels like it is a shifting to a position that is prior to or transcends the body, mind, organism, which is what the teachings were saying, because that shift happens, we then are compelled to put a big tick next to the teaching and say that is the truth. What it says is correct, that liberation, enlightenment, the process is not a process, because this shift happened in an instant. It happened spontaneously, and it wasn't something I did. And when that shift happens, it feels like it has nothing to do with the intellect. It's not because the intellect has said, oh, I get it. I'm not the body, mind, organism. I'm awareness. That's not what brings about the shift. The shift sort of just happens, it seems. That's what it feels like. It just happens, and it has nothing to do with my thinking. And so because of all of these factors, it's very easy for the seeker in which a shift has happened to think that it has nothing to do with the body, mind, organism, whereas in fact, on close investigation, it does. So I hope I'm not giving away too many secrets. I have trust that this explanation, this series of satsangs is in itself a teaching. I believe there's a great role for critical thinking in the seeking process. For a long time in the seeking process, a teaching can't rely on critical thinking. It has to, in a way, brainwash the ignorance out of the seeker. But unfortunately, brainwashing ignorance out of a seeker doesn't actually leave the seeker free of ignorance. It just means there's a new ignorance that at some point needs to fall away, and that new ignorance, which is less ingrained than the old ignorance, will only fall away when we start critical thinking. Critical thinking and looking at our experience more closely, which often requires some prompting. A teacher to say, hey, are you sure that what you have concluded is correct? Just because it feels like the shift is a spontaneous shift that happened, and it happened in an instant, and it happened not because the intellect thought about something. And what happened creates the sense that what you are is awareness and not the body. Are you sure that that is a reflection of truth? Are you sure that experience, that change in how you experience life, even if it is a shift from experience where there used to be subject-object relationship to where there is now the end of subject-object relationship, that feels much more true, especially given that the teaching said that subject-object relationship was the illusion. That does this new state that feels so much true, are you sure that that is the truth? Or could it be that there is a part of your intellect that is interpreting the situation without us even realizing it, because we don't necessarily know or see the interpretation. We just say, I'm not interpreting it. This is what the experience tells me. The experience that is now not the experience of illusion, because that has fallen away. What we are told is the oneness is truth or reality. We now see life as it is. But so we need to question, are we sure that that seeing is absolute? Are you sure it's not a new form of relative? Are you sure that what has happened is that a particular lens of relativity, a belief essentially about who you are you sure that that isn't what fell away? And what you're left with is a new subjective experience. Now, I'm not saying that that's a problem. Frankly, I don't see that we can have anything other than a subjective experience in life. So what I would suggest is an investigation to see whether what happened is a relative veil or lens that made life seem very relative, or was forcing us to experience life through a belief system. When that falls away, a layer of relativity has fallen away. And so what's left can feel like it is the end of relativity, what could be described as the absolute or truth. What if what is left is actually still relative, but now not relative to the extent that includes this very troublesome set of beliefs? Troublesome set of beliefs that caused suffering. So what happened when a layer of belief about who we are falls away? That's a great sign. That's a very big move towards knowing oneself more truly. But if we believe that what has happened is a revelation of truth where we know ourselves as awareness and all we are is awareness, we may be labeling, in fact, the experience, but labeling it from our experiential sense. So we'd say, well, I'm labeling it as it is. Well, that's what we were doing before when we had the more separate subject-object relationship to life. We were labeling it based on what it is. So what if we have got this wrong? The label of this new experience, what if we've got that wrong? And I would suggest we are not just consciousness or awareness. We are a human being that has an aspect, a layer to it, which is consciousness. And when certain beliefs about being just the physical get challenged, those beliefs fall away, and that aspect of consciousness, that layer of consciousness gets revealed, and there is essentially a waking up to the aspect of consciousness, which then allows life to be experienced from a new perspective. But what if that is the new perspective of a human being, a shifted human experience that allows the awareness aspect of the human to be there? Now, if that's the case, saying I am consciousness and I am not the body is an error. And it's an error while at the same time believing we know the truth of who we are. So let's go back to looking at why non-dual teachings take the approach, especially the top-down non-dual teachings. It's really important. The change that I said happens to the body-mind organism. So all of the change can only be change on the level of the body-mind organism. When we look at, so teachings are delivering concepts to the body-mind organism in such a way that the concept, even the concept that says time and space is not real, causality is not real, there is no person, you are not the body. Those are concepts in a teaching that hopefully get received by the mind organism and turn into a contemplation, turn into earnestness, to understand, to know, not necessarily on an intellectual level, but on a deep level, to know the truth that is being delivered through the teachings. Now, as I've said, no teaching is delivering us truth, but as a seeker, we can appreciate that teachings are delivering a wisdom that we can have a faith in, a trust in. The intellect might get a little carried away and not realize that they are pointers and think they are truth. But so nonetheless, any of these pointers are being delivered to the body-mind organism in order for a contemplation to happen. Now, the contemplation can only happen by the working mind, which is part of the body-mind, part of the body-brain. So awareness doesn't think. Awareness doesn't know how to contemplate. That is the intellect that contemplates. Now, let's just separate this out. There's the working mind and the thinking mind. The thinking mind is all of the thinking based on the false idea of who we are, the belief in personal doership, the belief that I am only a body, that I am separate, autonomous, that I need outcomes, pleasure, in order to be complete and happy. So everything that happens out of the thinking mind is illusion and delusion. It's essentially ignorance and includes in it an uncomfortableness because it includes in it a false self-image. The working mind, on the other hand, is functional thinking. And so a teaching is talking to the working mind. A teaching is trying to equip the working mind, just like a maths teacher would equip the working mind with mathematical formulas and explanations of how they work, in order to get the working mind to develop the concept for itself, to understand the concept for itself. And so when a teaching delivers a concept, even the concept that there is no person, that time and space are not real, that's there so that it can take hold in the body-mind organism, and then for the contemplation to happen, and the contemplation will deliver change, will deliver a deepening of the understanding, and that deepening understanding may actually settle in the form of insight. Now, insight is a movement of the intellect that feels very different to the average movement of the intellect. And so when insight happens, it feels like it has nothing to do with the intellect. We can introduce the notion of the deep intellect. The deep intellect functions in a way, at least this concept, in a way that is different. It's maybe you could say it is more of a quantum type functioning. And because we don't have access to that very often, because the thinking mind keeps thinking on a very rudimentary level, we don't have an experience of what the deep intellect, when it delivers an answer, what that feels like. And so when that starts happening in spiritual seeking, where the deep intellect starts having a chance to work because the working mind has received concepts from a teaching, has processed them as far as it can, and then hands over to the deep intellect without us actually realizing that a handover has happened. And because the deep intellect works, as the name suggests, on a very deep level, it's processing things without us knowing it's processing things. And when the deep intellect gets something, when it solves something, my suggestion is that it presents itself as what we know as insight. And insight delivers in it a completeness. There is a knowing that seems to be outside of the thinking that we're used to. And that's because the insight that has been delivered from the deep intellect, which can feel like it's come from outside, which then will build on our notion that these changes that happen have nothing to do with the intellect, because it doesn't feel like it has anything to do with the intellect. So hopefully you can see how we can conclude some things based on how something feels without realizing where it actually comes from or what the process really is. And our conclusion, like the insight had nothing to do with the body-mind, could be wrong. The deep intellect is, in my estimation, an extension of the body-mind organism that extends much deeper, like all of life does, much deeper than just the mechanics of things. So, all spiritual teachings is bringing about a change on the level of the instrument, such that at some point in time, the instrument, when it finds itself in a circumstance, reacts differently to what it used to react to how it used to, because it is now structurally different. So a lot of the insights that happen are changing the structure of the brain and the structure of our makeup on a very deep level, which is why over an extended period of time, when we look back on our experience of life, when the seeking has gone deep, we say, wow, I almost don't know myself relative to how I used to function and see life and feel life prior to seeking happening. Now, we might maintain a belief that I don't know myself because now I know myself as awareness that is outside of the body-mind organism. But that, to me, is not really what's happened. What's happened is change has happened on the level of the body-mind organism, which has by default meant a different experience happens from the perspective of the body-mind organism. So I'd like to talk about why things are said, what changes happen. Now, in my experience, and I happened to have a type of thinking that through the process was very interested in the process. And because I was interested in the process, I guess I can talk about the process maybe better than some other people who have found the change happening, but are not necessarily particularly familiar with what happened, because they might not have been that interested in the process when it was happening. Having said that, what I have seen as being what has happened in the process may not be at all what actually happens. But I think on some level it is what actually happens. So it's worth talking about. The first significant part of the process for me was the part of the process that created a separation on, you could say, an experiential level. A separation of consciousness from the body-mind organism and the thinking and the emotions. An experiential recognition of everything arising in consciousness and not being separate from consciousness. The whole thing being a single oneness experience, completely interdependent and not separate from consciousness. What that exploration does is create a separating of layers of the human being that were previously heavily enmeshed, and And the separation is a separation such that the awareness or consciousness aspect gets to witness the functioning of the human being, or the arising of the external world from a position of non-involvement, where it sees movement in life as a happening. The second part of the process is the undoing of the beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome. Now, the second part is heavily influenced by the first part. Now, to further complicate things, when I say second part is heavily influenced by the first part, it doesn't have to be that what I'm referring to as the first part, the recognition of consciousness and a witnessing, doesn't have to come first. It can come second. And in that case, what I'm referring to as the second part, which is the undoing of the beliefs, can actually come first. So this goes back to a question that Steve asked a few days ago. Can you start off by getting to the core of the issue, being maybe a recognition of the aspect of self that was previously unrecognized, and then backfill in some of the misunderstandings, or can the misunderstandings then be dissolved after getting to the core of the issue of who you are? And the answer is absolutely yes. For many people on a non-dual path, they are attracted and resonate to the top-down teachings that point at the essence of who you are, and an awakening happens. And then, to be honest, if you speak to people who have an awakening, a lot of extra work needs to happen in terms of bringing the intellect in line with what has actually taken place. And that is part of the process of reintegrating the realization that I am consciousness, reintegrating it into being a human being, where the realization is I'm not consciousness, I am a human being, which includes at its core consciousness. Before awakening, we had the understanding I am a human being, and no appreciation for the core of the human being that was always there, being consciousness. So that means that before any awakening or spiritual seeking, we know ourselves only as the changeable, very changeable aspects of the human being. And knowing ourselves that way means we really don't know ourselves. So we feel uncomfortable. Knowing ourselves as awareness reveals the core of the human being, but often it reveals it whereby the seeker has discarded the body and the emotions and the thoughts as being anything to do with it. And so in a way there is a not knowing oneself again. Now you know the core, but you don't know the clothing. And to know the human being, to know yourself fully, is to know yourself as the human being, which includes both the clothing and the core. So it can very much happen either way. You can start off undoing the beliefs, and then insights come and awakening of different forms. It doesn't have to be of the form that I'm speaking about here, where there is a very big oneness experience. It can be much more subtle, but just for the sake of the discussion. So those people that haven't had big awakenings of oneness, don't think that because I'm speaking about them that they're missing, because they can present, the witnessing can present in very subtle ways. What's the litmus test for whether your seeking is complete or on track is not the existence of an awakening experience, but rather whether there is a witnessing of your own emotions and your own thoughts, where they can be seen. Not necessarily where you can see it and you say, well, I see it from a place of knowing myself as formless awareness in which everything arises. It doesn't have to be extreme. you can just say, well, I just see it as a human being. I can see my own thinking. That means that this separation has happened. And it may have happened as you tripped over a rock when you were walking, and all you know of the event was the tripping over of the rock. Right? So it doesn't have to present in some fantastic, mind-blowing peak experience fashion. So if someone is able to see their thoughts, and that in itself is a form of witnessing. So the litmus test is actually not even the witnessing, because the witnessing can fade away such that it sort of seems irrelevant to witness. And that happens when the suffering has become fairly non-existent. Then this notion of witnessing, it's like, well, what am I witnessing? Because really the witnessing is important when suffering is there, in order for us to witness the suffering. So the real litmus test is whether there is peace of mind in daily living, even in the face of challenging circumstances. Okay, going back to these changes. You can have the awakening first, and then are looking at what really is still there on the relative level, the body, the thoughts, and coming back to investigate and undo the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome. Or you can be investigating on the level of doership and attachment, and then an awakening to consciousness happens. If the awakening happens first, you find yourself in your seeking doing a lot of the groundwork first, then when a certain awakening, realization, or separation, well, not really separation, it's ironic, we call it a separation, but it's more about a realization that we're not separate. If the groundwork happens first and then there's some sort of awakening, then there's less work, much less work to do after the awakening. So in the recognition of one's nature as consciousness, one of the techniques, or one of the things that gets in the way of a recognition of that, what gets in the way of a certain shift happening, is the intellect, both the working mind and the thinking mind, that continue to maintain our assessment of the world as we've always assessed the world. And in large part, that means assessing the world as an unfolding of causality, assessing the world as an objective reality in time and space, and our use of language, which by default creates a separation of one object versus another object. So if the aim of a teaching is to create an experiential recognition of oneness, which, as you may remember, I'm saying is not actually the end goal, but it is a very significant part of the process that allows for a witnessing to set in that didn't used to be there before. And once this witnessing sets in, that's when someone can feel for themselves that experientially, not just experientially in terms of how life is experienced as one separation, but more on a level of the experience of suffering. When that shift happens, we feel that the suffering has somehow lost its edge, has become less intense. There is a space that allows the suffering to be seen as much less personal. Now, that space is so important for the, well, one, it's important for diminishing the intensity of the suffering. But two, it's important at helping in the subsequent process where the beliefs at the core start getting looked at. I think maybe because of the fact that I'm putting so much information forward, we can pause it for today and maybe carry it on tomorrow. Before we do that, I would like to point us to the stillness and the silence that really the teaching, the changes deliver. We could have satsang that just directs everyone into stillness and silence, directs them into a direct contact with what we are at our core, directs us out of the thinking mind where we foresee problems in the future, we're holding on to things that didn't go right in the past. And we can, if we are in community together in one space and maybe even online, sense a dropping out of thinking into being. So if that's what we were trying to do in satsang, the words would be very different. The energy would be very different. And there's a great value in that because it allows us to understand for ourselves that the thinking mind is what creates the uncomfortableness. And if we just come into the present moment, here, now, where there aren't any problems, unless we think about them. No need to think about what I was talking about before. Just feel your own presence and existence. And drop into that. Understand that what you are at your core is not vulnerable, is not affected by circumstance. That what you are at your core is unchanging and in itself peaceful. It doesn't ask whether it will exist tomorrow. It doesn't worry about whether it existed in the past. It just knows that it is now. So we all have this capacity to rest in being outside of thinking, and we can be direct there. And there's a time and a place for that. So I wanted to end a satsang that had less of that in it, with a reminder that that's really what it's all about. Because as the process brings about the changes on the level of the body-mind organism, through whichever teaching and whatever methodology the teaching knows is needed, as the teaching goes to work, the changes we get left with are changes on the body level, body-mind level, whereby the thinking mind that is a result of the brain falls away. So if peace of mind is the end of suffering, doesn't it mean that the body-mind organism has changed? Otherwise, the suffering would remain. So the suffering happened on the level of the body-mind. So if it's about the end of suffering, it means the body-mind must have changed such that it doesn't create suffering anymore. So let's not lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, when all of the new conditioning that brings about change has done its job. It's just about us resting while still functioning in daily life, doing whatever we need to do, facing our daily life with the understanding that the suffering is something from the past. So in tomorrow's satsang, we'll talk about why the notion that's put forward that says time and space is not real, that causality is not real, that life is spontaneous, it's an arising in consciousness, that there is no process, that everyone is already enlightened. We'll talk about why that is said, to hopefully demonstrate that bringing the brain, essentially manipulating the brain by restricting certain functions of the brain, by making certain statements that relegate that type of thinking into the area of ignorance, which therefore gives the brain instruction, in a sense, not to do that, which is a way of diminishing the function of the brain temporarily. We hopefully can see that if we turn certain features off in the brain, a certain perspective can present more easily than if those functions and features of the brain are left active. Now, we might conclude, when those features are turned off, we might conclude that those features are the problem. In fact, those features then need to be turned back on again, but they can get turned back on again without creating the obstacle that they did in the first place, because something will have changed. So until I see you again, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining, and peace for now.